All right. Well, it's great to be back at CyFy, and glad to see all of you and many of my colleagues here on the panel. Otherwise, I'm Chris Painter. I've been involved in cyber issues for about 27 years now in different capacities, most recently the coordinator for cyber policy issues at the US State Department. And today we're going to discuss in our panel this issue of militarization of cyberspace, but also how do we deal with it? How do we try to make the rules of the road more predictable? How do we reach a more stable cyberspace? And I think there are a lot of interesting questions that are teed up here. Obviously, as other folks have said, we are far more dependent on these technologies than we ever have been before. At the same time, we see almost every country developing cyber capabilities, which is hardly surprising because this is a new area not just for progress and for social and economic growth, but it's also something where states are developing capabilities for intelligence gathering, for defensive purposes, and even for offensive purposes. And that has serious implications as we look at the entire sphere, because different nations are certainly going to be at different levels of involvement. They're going to have different capabilities. And there's not really a good sense of stability and predictability in the space because of issues around attribution, of how the internet is architected, and it's unclear where attacks are coming from, which is the base attribution problem. And certainly we have criminal and other groups, and you don't need to be a state actor to have capability in this area. There's a lot of instability, uncertainty, and how do we deal with that instability and uncertainty? How do we make sure this is a more predictable sphere so that states can relate to each other in a more predictable way, that there are de-escalation paths to make sure we don't have cyber conflict that is inadvertent, and how do we come up with rules of the road to deal with how states use these activities in cyberspace? Now, there's been a lot of activity, and we'll discuss this on this panel in the last few years. There's been work in the UN group of governmental experts around norms of behavior, application of international law, confidence building measures, all important, and we'll deal with those in more depth. But the most recent GG this year was unable to reach consensus among the various states because there are serious divisions on how we think about this. So without further ado, I want to turn to my panel. We have assembled a great panel here from really all over the place with all kinds of different backgrounds. Paolo Ciocca is the Deputy Director General of Security Intelligence Department of the Republic of Italy. Xiangyang Liu is the Senior Fellow, Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Paul Maddinson is the Deputy Director for Operations of the not so new anymore, but relatively recent UK National Cyber Security Center. Iddo Moed is the Cybersecurity Coordinator for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel, my former counterpart. Yoko Nitta is the Senior Fellow of Japan Society for Security and Crisis Management. And Chelsey is the Officer of Cyber Defense at NATO. So what I'd like to do is first turn to a couple of our panelists to discuss, first Yoko, and then Paul, to discuss really what are the trends we're seeing? What kinds of cyber attacks have we seen that involve states, and what are some of the implications of this? And then we're going to turn to a more general discussion about stability more generally, and I'll get more into detail on that. So let me turn it to you.
Okay. So thank you very much, everyone. Yoko Nitta. So I'm going to talk about more like a recent trend of cyber attacks. Okay. So this year, 2017 has become the year of cyber crimes, as you might already know. The major malware and attack techniques have continued to evolve and have been slipping through the security solution with a clever trick. So last year, advanced new malware appeared at a certain frequency, and new features and diffusion methods and attack services began to be paid for on multiple platforms. So this year, new trends have also been confirmed. The simple yet every effective malware family is in the blink of a mess in the world. So the first half of this year, cyber attacks occurred at a pace more than usual. As evidenced by the recent security breaches here, the cyber attacks this year have become increasingly vicious in terms of speed, scale, and persistence. In any region of the world, there is a massive attack without exception, and a need for proactive security solutions is growing. So it is a massive attack campaign represented by WannaCry, NotPayer, and Firewall to symbolize the latest threat trends. as the year progresses, the following trends have been repeatedly confirmed throughout the world. So number one state-level hacking tool in the hands of cyber criminals. It's very much related with the also information manipulation by hacking. It's not only affecting presidential elections and diplomatic relations now. It has become a powerful new weapon which changed the world from fundamentally. A lot of cyber attacks like rushing, for example, to hunt you like a shadow. So they try to shake up the domestic affairs in favor of their own diplomacy. So I read the article this morning. The Russian national industries, they decided to provide North Korea, provide the net service servers with the North Korea. For example, for Japan case, there are a lot of parliament members, and we have so many abduction cases. So sometimes they need to speak up that kind of a case. And then who criticized this North Korean for abduction cases, the members of parliament got hacked and got threatened and disseminated emails to demean them. So this is what's happening. So I would like to talk about a little bit more about North Korean cyber power here. Of course, the suspicion has emerged that North Korea has organized cyber attacks on banks around the world. The Bangladesh case is very much popular, I think. And robbed large sums of money and it can become a new source of nuclear and missile development of them. So of course, the United States tried to call embarking on strengthening sanctions to cut off North Korea's funding sources, but fears that the sanctions will be fade if the funds continue to be funded by cyber attacks. Cyber criminals, are likely to intensify. North Korea's nuclear and missiles are still in experimental stages, but cyber attacks have been implemented many times already. There are a few real cyber attacks, the level of which strikes the use of force on international law, but they are no longer hesitant to utilize the cybercrime and cyber operations. Last month, a few days before the Seoul Defense Dialogue, North Korea's Central Telecommunication Agency reported that North Korea had developed a nuclear warhead that will be able to add an EMP attack. When an EMP attack occurs, infrastructure and telecommunication equipment may become dysfunctional and disrupt critical infrastructure, such as power supply and then transportation networks. An EMP attack would be a somewhat different field of electronic warfare than cyber attacks, but it would not make much sense to do that sort of a division anymore, because the first thing that should be considered in cyber deterrence theory in the middle of construction that in the actual war, only cyber attacks are rarely performed independently, combined with physical attacks and psychological warfare. In other words, hybrid attacks and cross-domain attacks are used. So there's lots of hybrid warfare going on. And a target which is not related to the backside of the earth is aimed at secondarily, but geopolitical, geo-economic extension relations is targeted.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. If you,
Did you say you needed one more minute?
yeah, I'd like to talk about more, but maybe later.
Okay, good. Thank you for that presentation. And I think, it's interesting, one of the things we always thought of is we kind of thought we knew what all the attacks would be, attacks against major infrastructures. What we didn't really think of, I think, in the US is attacks that really undermine democratic processes. And so, every year when I come to CyFy, there's a new attack vector. There's a new way of thinking about this that we hadn't thought about before. And being ahead of that curve is difficult. And of course, those kinds of attacks are not just cyber attacks. They're hybrid attacks, as you said. And the way you blunt those attacks are not just through cyber means. Paul, can you pick up a little more and talk about the trends and threats you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the UK perspective, I think I'd pick out 4 types of threats that have been concerned to us over the last year. Some of these are not new, but have really hit us or countries that we work with. I mean, the first one is an increasing trend to target and disrupt critical national infrastructure. We've seen in the UK increased targeting of energy and other critical national infrastructure companies. But I think it's probably in the Ukraine where there has been the biggest series of disruptive attacks affecting their transport and their energy sector, which really shows us how this cyber capability can be used for malicious purposes. The second trend I'd pull out is ransomware, not just as a criminal tool, which has been growing for a number of years, but ransomware as a disruptive cyber capability. We saw with WannaCry around the world, but in the UK in particular, that ransomware can disrupt networks just as much as it can be used to generate revenue. And I think this was followed up fairly quickly with the NotPetya ransomware, which many have argued was not, in fact, ransomware at all and wasn't really intended to generate criminal revenue, but was intended to disrupt. And again, Ukraine was the principal target of that, but it had an effect around the world, including in the UK. The third one I was going to pick out, which has been mentioned, is the threat to democracy. We learned very much from the experiences of other countries. We had a snap general election in the UK this year. We put a lot of focus and effort in trying to understand and mitigate the threats to the general election process. Just after the end of that election, our Parliament was subjected to a repeated series of intrusions, and then the Scottish Parliament. So that threat to democracy has really come alive for us this year. And then lastly, I'd pull out supply chain threats. So again, they've been talked about a lot in conferences around the world for a number of years, but this year we saw quite large-scale compromises of managed service providers, global IT companies, and the access to their networks potentially gives the access to thousands of clients worldwide, which is a scale of threat that's really challenging to deal with.
Well, certainly, I think what we've seen just globally is threats have increased. I think every time we come back here together or go to any other of the myriad of conferences out there, the threats have increased. I think, Paolo, you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yes, it works. 30 seconds. Let me be a bit of a bottom liner. From a government perspective, from an Italian perspective, but with a bit of a more global contribution, I want to pick up one point that Paul made on Petya, not Petya, for example, but WannaCry could be similar. What is that we have understood? What is that now we know a bit better? I would say that we now know a bit better what a weapon is, if I may put it that way. Because if you have a ransomware that does not permit to pay a ransom, but it encrypts your data and important data, bookkeeping of a major multinational, operational software of a major multinational, so that the data cannot be recovered at all since the beginning, per purpose. Let me be analyst, that's my job. With the effect of declared damages in the order of hundreds of millions, almost billion, declared, then something else. This is a weapon in the true sense. Why is this new? Because this is not intended only for military purposes. This is a weapon that enters into the civilian realm, and this is something new. It is not new, but to this scale, I would say it's something new to which we have to adapt. Thank you, Chris.
Sure. So against this backdrop of ever-increasing threats, ever more serious threats, ever unanticipated threats by a number of state actors and non-state actors too, I think we want to focus for this panel a little more on the state actors and what kinds of things we can do to address these threats, both long-term and in the short term. And as we think about this, we've talked about this concept of global cyber stability and how we can achieve global cyber stability, which would not eliminate all the threats to be sure, but would give you a more predictable environment. As we have all of these countries developing these capabilities, some using these capabilities, whether for intelligence or military purposes, what are the broad spectrum of measures we can approach? And I mentioned at the opening, one of the things that we've spent several years on now, and India has been part of this discussion in this last year's GG, and they were 2 times ago in the GG as well, is trying to come up with a stability framework that makes it more predictable in cyberspace. So that really has 3 components. One is that international law applies in cyberspace, just like it does in the physical world. Now, what that means and how international law actually applies is still being worked out, but it's really important as a core concept to say that international law applies, including things like the law of armed conflict, things that apply in the physical world, that you have the same application in the cyber world. Because otherwise it's just a free fire zone. Two, that you have norms of responsible behavior below that threshold of armed conflict. We all talk about cyber war all the time. Frankly, I don't think we've seen cyber war, and I'd be interested in people's perspectives as they answer this next part of the questions on that. We've certainly seen cyber conflict, but not really at that high level of war. So how do you deal with these things that fall below that high threshold? And what we try to settle on is voluntary norms of behavior, things like not attacking the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime, things like not attacking the certs, don't go after the ambulances that actually help mitigate harm on the internet, and expectations of assisting other countries. And there's been some widespread adoption of those. People, I think, are comfortable with this idea of norms and confidence building measures, just transparency measures, doctrine, points of conduct. There's been a lot of, I think, consensus globally on those issues, less consensus on how international law applies, and I think a lot of still uncertainty about what doctrines are and how people use this. So you know, I think we've done a lot of good work in terms of the norms development and the stability framework in a very short period of time. However, I think we're slowing down now. I think the fact that this GG wasn't able to reach consensus this last time indicates that area of finding consensus is much tougher. We also have to broaden that consensus and talk to a larger part of the world. So that's all important, and I want to turn to the panelists to address different aspects of these issues, including aspects around attribution, around resilience, around some of the military organizations and how we're doing this. Let me turn first to Iddo, and then I'll move down the line.
Thank you, Chris. So, good morning, everyone. I think first just a quick word about cyber war. That's a very interesting question that is being answered very differently among different players, different countries. Some say we already are very far advanced in a war, already 10 years inside some kind of a cyber war. And others say we are not there yet, and this cataclysmic event has not happened yet, and therefore a lot of the measures are not taken yet that are needed to be to increase cyber stability. From Israel's point of view, of course, these processes are extremely important. The process of the discussion of better understanding what responsible state behavior means in cyber. And once we all agree that international law applies, the question is indeed, as just Chris pointed out, how do we apply it? And that question is basically, I think, the most important issue that we should be delving into, and that is creating sort of a joint language and better understanding what we are talking about when we are talking about critical infrastructures. As an example, when we all think about utilities and central organizations and so on, but what about elections? At some point in time, you realize that the election process is a critical process in a specific time. So that means that we need to further discuss this. We are always a bit behind the attackers, and we are always a bit behind the evidence that's produced that shows us that we need to delve deeper. So this race to better understand what we are talking about, this is actually, I think, the most important part of it, of this discussion. And that discussion always requires to have other players around the table, not just the politicians. Our part is, of course, very complicated because we involve in this discussion a lot of political aspects, and that blurs the discussion. So the basic tenets for, or the basic pillars for this process, I think, at this point in time are mostly regional organizations where you're having like-minded countries better understand what the norms are, and we all understand that norms need to be voluntary and non-binding. We don't fully understand the technology. There is, of course, the political leeway that we need to keep. And I think that we have to be looking at creating resilience and stability through these kinds of work. By the way, this very conference is a very important part of it. But this process is actually missing in many of the discussions about cyber stability, of creating joint language and better understanding what we are talking about when we're talking about cyber security. And for us, I think it's one of the most important pillars. The last part of it is, of course, developing the capability to better understand, and I'm talking about the human factor. So that is, on the one hand, awareness creating, and the other hand is training. Perhaps I'll delve into that a bit later, but I think we have to keep that in mind, that there is a huge gap between the technological side and the strategic political side, and that gap also needs to be bridged. If we don't fully understand what the implications are of different types of attack, we don't understand it quickly enough, very strange things can happen and strange decisions can be made. So I'll keep it to that.
Let me just, before I move on to the next speaker, just a question for you. I mean, one of the problems I think we addressed last year here at CyFy too was that, you know, there's been a lot of progress made in these UN groups and other places to advance some understanding of the rules of the road in cyberspace at a voluntary level. But a lot of the world hasn't been part of those discussions. And how can we, if we can't make more progress in that larger UN setting in terms of further how international law applies, at least in the immediate term, how do we take the progress that's already been made and try to get that spread out to more countries around the world? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, sure. So on this issue, I think there are different ways to follow. First and foremost, as I mentioned, the regional organizations point to this sort of a like-minded atmosphere, that where countries that are linked, where a lot of confidence already exists, can work together and better understand what kind of measures need to be taken. This also points to the idea of perhaps adopting some of the processes that exist elsewhere in arms control and so on, and see how they can be used within the sphere of creating better understanding how responsible state behavior should be applied and how it should be monitored. The second part of it, of course, is capacity building, and that is working hard to making sure that we all understand each other and we all work on the same page, so looking for a better understanding how to deal with cybercrime, and on a broader perspective, of course, how we apply international law.
Okay. Paolo, Italy chaired the G7 this year, which obviously doesn't include all the countries around the world, but it's a smaller select group. But in the past, it's often been a catalyst for making some progress in this area. And indeed, in the cyber area, there's some progress made this year. But more generally than that, I wanted you to address some of the issues we just talked about, and also address this issue of how we might be able to better and more broadly harness international efforts to help with some of the attribution issues, which makes this area so difficult and so volatile in terms of figuring out how you respond to some of these cyber incidents.
Thank you, Chris. Quick and straight reaction, and I'll try to be a bit schematic. From a perspective, a set of government, and what level of government, the one that has to sign off an attribution. In our system, my department is that piece of government which at the apical level in the end says to a prime minister the who's and the why's, the what is easier. So quick intervention on what? I would say mainly in order, if I may, to disambiguate. Do you say this in English? Sort of? Yes, good. A couple of disambiguations. First, disambiguation. Attribution is not the technical attribution. The attribution in the government sense is something different. It takes into account a technical attribution, to be clear. By technical attribution, I mean the one that can be made on the basis of technical facts, of an analysis of forensics. It can be even, let's say, widened through open source data. It can and will even more take, let's say, into account big data analysis. But in the end, this will never be only the block that, let's say, the thought that the government will make when a government will attribute. Attribution in the government sense is something which is always all source. And by all source, I mean technical, and I would say non-technical. What is the non-technical? All that pieces that a government has at its ends, which means then Diplo, MIL, Intel, law enforcement, and these are, I would say, the traditional ones, financial, economic, trade, and I could go on counting, but all these pieces have to come together when you have let's say, a final government assessment on the who's and the why's. Also because this assessment carries a sovereign responsibility. In the end, it is the government that has an idea on who has done it and why it has done this. Second is ambiguation. Is attribution certain? Maybe not. But I would say governments, in the end, do know who's been, the whys and the who's. They do know. They will come. Sorry, let me put this other way. And Chris, I am not a diplomat, maybe you realized, and a bit more as an economist and a bottom line and a bit more straight. In the end, a government will know whether a government will want to say that it knows and what they will do with the fact that what they know is a different story. But I would say this is important. The question is then how you bring in allies and international community into this attribution process. Out of experience, I would say crucial is the cooperation with the private sector. You always have to have open channels with the private sector. They will help you for sure on the technical side, not only in that, even in contextualization. But in the end, as I said, it's a bit of a lonely exercise of government in putting together the pieces of the puzzle. It is lonely, quoted unquoted. It is classified, obviously. Does it mean that it is alone? No, a government will never be alone. It will have, let's say, on its parts and through the correct channels, allies, alliances, thinking of NATO, regional areas, European Union in our context, bilateral, and through Diplo, MIL, Intel, and others, and you will come to an assessment. Final point, and why do I say this when I say sovereign? Sovereign because in the end, and a tool that a government has is asymmetry in response. I mean, it is asymmetric, the threat and the attack, but you have also asymmetry in response. And you have to have asymmetry in response, to which is a major tool for a government to decide on what side, on let's say at what level, Diplo, Intel, MIL, Eco, Fin, Trade, and so on, to respond. Let me stop here for the moment and ready to come back.
So one thing I hear you saying is that attribution is not just a technical issue, but often is a political issue at the end. And as you think about larger, well, political in the terms of it's an issue for governments to decide, a state issue. Okay. But they base it on policy means, not just on technical means. That's fair. And that obviously raises some issues in trying to do more global attribution, because can you really get agreement by various actors? And does that in fact make any response to an attack undoable? Because if no one can agree, then you're frozen into inaction. Paul, you part of your job is to actually take attribution and figure out what to do. So do you have some comments on this?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to comment. I agree entirely with what Paolo has said, actually. Just to add a couple of other bits, there seems to be a perception that attribution of cyber attacks is impossible, and to a certain extent that gives hackers the feeling that they're untouchable and therefore they can do what they want. Certainly from our perspective, it's exactly the same. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. We often have a good idea based on all the information available, particularly around a pattern of activity about who is behind particular cyber attacks. But again, that is inside government rather than necessarily, it's a political decision whether the government wants to publicly state who it believes is behind it. The problem with that, of course, is it's not evidence. The evidence often would require cooperation of the nation state that is hosting the hackers, which is often not forthcoming. So I think we need a bit of a shift in the way we think about this and look at this, given the importance within global cyber stability of attribution. So from my perspective, there is, what is your level of evidence? Is it a criminal justice outcome that you're trying to achieve, or is it actually, as you've said, a political process that must take into account geopolitical factors. And the other factor is where is the burden of proof? At the moment, the burden of proof seems to be on the victim to prove beyond reasonable doubt that a certain hacker or a group of hackers is behind an attack, whether state-sponsored or not. I think we need to look at whether we can shift that burden of proof so it's not just on the victim. If there is reasonable suspicion, then it should be incumbent upon states in particular to engage in that process to understand where cyber attacks are coming from.
And I think this is one of the concerns as we get into deterrence too. Does this overly constrain action taken against transgressors, and becomes a real problem? As you say, there's various kinds of attribution you can do. You don't have 100% certainty in the physical world. You really need that in the cyber world. And I recall when we had the North Korea attacks on Sony Pictures, everyone was saying it's North Korea. When the US government came out and says North Korea, we had all these people saying, oh, it's not North Korea. So that itself causes, I think, some problems. Does anyone else want to just briefly address the attribution issue before I move on to some of the other issues? Okay, well, you can address it in your comments as we go forward. I now want to turn to another aspect of this, and we'll come back to a lot of these things as we go forward. But one of the ways we can build better stability is through alliances and militaries around the world doing more to come up with their own doctrine, making sure that they have their own defenses in place. So let me turn to you, Chelsey, to talk about some of what's going on in NATO.
You bet. Thank you very much, Chris. And first, let me thank the organizers for the kind invitation today. It's really nice to be with you here in Delhi. And what I'd like to do in view of the broader discussion we're having on trends and stability architectures is give you a sense of NATO's approach from a political military alliance perspective. And I'd like to address practical examples, answering questions such as how are NATO and its allies enhancing resilience? How are we working with partners, including the private sector? And of course, then, what contribution can we make to a more stable cyberspace? So before diving into the cyber aspect specifically, I'd like just to recall a few principles about NATO more broadly. Namely, it's a political military alliance with a common goal for nearly 70 years of preventing conflict, of preserving peace. An alliance of 29 NATO allies now, which promise to defend one another as part of a collective defense organization. And a big important component of our approach to security and defense also includes partnerships, so the cooperative security aspect. So what then is the alliance's approach to cyber defense? How are we tackling this challenge? I would say very much that the approach mirrors what we do in other domains, part of NATO's broader mandate, including the principles that we abide by. And cyber defense very much supports NATO's broader deterrence and defense mission. NATO allies indeed have recognized that international law, including the UN Charter, applies in cyberspace. And this is very important for recognizing that actions in cyberspace are governed by rules. NATO allies have also recognized that cyber attacks can reach a threshold that can threaten stability, prosperity, and security, which is why allies have also recognized that cyber defense is part of NATO's core task of collective defense. And this is important for clarifying our thinking on the issue and indicating as well our intentions. Now, the mandate is defensive in nature. Main objective is to protect NATO networks, operations and missions, but of course to enhance resilience across an alliance of 29 different countries. Because our armed forces and militaries, they're not immune to some of the challenges that emanate from cyberspace. And we rely increasingly on cyberspace to carry out our missions and operations. We've already spoken about some of the trends in the threat landscape, and increasingly this blurring line between war and peace, activities below the threshold of armed conflict, hybrid components, really make an important part of our work to try to tackle this challenge now. So Chris, I'm going to address the question too, how can improved military cyber resilience help stabilize the international security architecture from an alliance perspective? Well, as I mentioned, NATO is a political and military alliance faced with similar challenges as a user of cyberspace. We've taken a serious yet measured approach informed by evolutions in the cyber threat landscape. 3 key points to leave you with. The first is that we're investing in cyber defense and enhancing cyber resilience. Allies continue to develop capabilities, capacity, share best practices, and enhance information sharing. On the resilience piece, allies adopted a cyber defense pledge at the highest level, heads of state and government, in 2016, because they recognized the importance at a strategic level, not just technical, but strategic and political, of addressing this issue. Having strategies in place, organizational structures, and importantly, channels of communication for working with partners. We also recognize the need to organize ourselves and prepare our commanders for an assumption that we might be operating in a contested or degraded environment. So last year, allies recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations in which it must defend itself as effectively as it does in air, land, and sea. Now, in concrete terms, work is currently underway to review the way we think, train, equip, and collaborate in this space. Second important pillar, partnerships. Cyber defense is a team sport, and it requires cooperation across borders, and the military cannot ensure security by themselves in this domain, like perhaps they might be able to in other more conventional areas. So NATO works with its partners based on shared values and mutual interest. Understanding better one another's approaches, the more we understand, the better prepared we can be. And I'd highlight here that we work with more than 40 different countries as part of a cooperative approach, other international organizations, and importantly, the private sector and academia, notably through NATO's Industry Cyber Partnership. And indeed, during the recent global incidents, WannaCry and NotPetya, this direct communication channel with the operators of cyberspace, the first responders, was absolutely critical. So we really place an emphasis on the cooperative security aspect. And last, the alliance supports activities designed to limit the risk of conflict. NATO is not a norm-setting organization. However, NATO allies welcome and strongly support those activities that are currently underway, developing norms, confidence-building measures in cyberspace to enhance stability. And I'd mention here the Talon Manual, which perhaps some of you are familiar with, a project that was sponsored by NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And this was a really instrumental project in that it tried to look at how international law applies both in times of conflict but also peacetime. And I would add this is particularly important in trying to figure out these gray areas where we see a lot of cyber conflict currently taking place. And of course, we look forward to India hosting the Global Cyber Space Conference next month. Platforms for dialogue like this are important for incorporating perspectives from other regions and organizations. So I'll leave it at that with a final conclusion on stability, that in the end, the international community stands to benefit from a norms-based, predictable, and secure global cyberspace. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for that. And I should add my congratulations to India hosting the Global Cyberspace Conference next month. It's a huge undertaking. I think I've been involved in every one of them since the beginning in London. And I think they have actually, like this conference, like the CyFy conference, helped advance the discussion of these issues among a variety of stakeholders. So I think it's very important that this is taking place in India coming forward. Let me shift. So you talked about how military resilience and some of the policies could help stability in cyberspace, but let me take it a little broader and ask Chuanying, in terms of just overall resilience. I mean, there's an old adage that offense always beats defense, right? That it's much easier to do offense than defense. But can general stability and better resilience of the overall ICT infrastructure, can there things that be done that can shift that balance so that you have a more stable environment, because even if countries are developing these capabilities, you have more resilience to respond? Can you address that? And also feel free to address other things that you've heard so far.
First, thank you, the organizer, for organizing this I think it's very good panel, because you have people from different backgrounds. You have academic, you have decision maker, you have operators here. I think militarization of the cyberspace is a very important topics need to be completely, discussed. There are a lot of things we haven't figured out, and a lot of unexpected consequences caused by this process. And as a representative from, not from a like-minded country, So I would like to share some of my observations from our, if you do not have a strong alliance, if you're not like-minded countries, what do you think of this process and what challenges you will face? So first, I would like to start from the perceptions about the militarization of cyberspace. Because as the military, you always look at, or you define the cyberspace as the fifth domain. You know, this domain, you need to develop your capabilities, defensive or offensive. You need to pursue your advantage toward your enemies or competitors. But if you, from an academic perspective, you would like to take it from a broader picture, because cyberspace not only the fifth domain, but also you have a lot of the commercial activities. You have a lot of the people's digital lives relied on the cyberspace. So you need to balance the military activities and its impact toward the other two parts. So I would like to say that from our military perspectives, your goal is quite clear. You pursue the advantage and you try to make the cyberspace stable. But from our scholar perspectives, your goal probably much higher. You need to balance these different activities, and you need to put the peace and the prosperities as the highest goal. So then I come to the second point, the unexpected and expected consequences of the militarization, because as the panelists all said that 140 countries are developing cyber capabilities, right? No matter what happens, you need to keep in mind those consequences. The first is for example, like the proliferation of the cyber weapons. We already experience a lot of this kind of the accident, like the Eternal Blue and the WannaCry, or this kind of things will not contribute to the stability of the cyberspace. So when you develop your cyber capabilities, you need to put this into the consideration. And secondly, the impact on the global economy, right? So when you have more and more such kind of the accident, you just undermine people's confidence about the global economy, especially from the ICT perspectives. We have been experienced a lot, especially from a lot of countries now focus on to strengthen their regulations under the name of national security. Because it's understandable when in the past, traditionally, when you have a trade, it's just commercial activities. But right now you have trade based on data. It could be to use to violate your national security. So this posed a lot of the challenges to the countries. And third, arms race, right? We have been, when you develop your capabilities to protect yourself, but when other countries all do the same things, it doesn't mean you are more secure than before. And lastly, I think from our developing countries' perspective, there are a lot of things you need, the capabilities you also need to develop while you decide to, to strong your capabilities in cyberspace. And first is our previous panelists already discussed the capabilities of attribution. If you want to use your defensive or offensive cyber operations in the cyberspace, so attribution is the very important capability no matter technical attribution or social engineering or information sharing, whatever. And secondly, the capability to understand how international law applied in cyberspace. We have a group of very good experts working in this area for a long time, but it's still hard for when you're developing countries. It needs time to better understand how each different articles implying what it means to your national security, what it means advantage for you or disadvantage to you. And third, you need to establish a domestic law or procedures when you engage such kind of the operations. Most countries, because cyber operation is new, kind of new, especially for those 140 countries. I believe that over 100 countries, they probably do not have a domestic law and procedures how to engage in such kind of operations. And fourth, it's important is how you manage escalations. When you decide to use the cyber operation, you expect it, you will have retaliations from your target. So you do not want to, this kind of operation cause a comprehensive war between two countries. So are you capable to manage the escalation? You need to think of that. And lastly, I think it's very important to make a political decision whether to, when you have conflict, when you decide to use cyber operations, it is not a law issue. It is not a technical issue. I think it's more importantly, it is a political issue, right? This is a big challenge for the leaders who may not know too much about international law or may not know too much about their techniques. How you make the political decision to do that, I think it also needs to be discussed. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments on that? Okay, well, I'll move forward. So, I think one of the issues here is we've talked about shaping the international environment. And, I think everyone agrees there's a lot of instability in the international environment right now, and there's a lot that could be done. There's some stuff that's being done. But when bad actors in cyberspace, whether they be criminal, but we'll focus on nation-state bad actors, if there's no action taken against them, aren't we creating a norm that action is okay? Isn't one of the things that is contributing to instability in cyberspace that we don't have good deterrence? And can we really deter actions in cyberspace? Is there a doctrine or are there things that we should be doing differently? Because frankly, if people can do bad things, there's no real consequences for them. The message is do bad things again. And so how do you deal with these transgressors? How do you really think about deterrence? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to address it in any order, and then I have some thoughts too. Iddo?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. I think it's a very important question, how do you create deterrence? And that's a process that is being worked on by many countries in terms of kind of countermeasure or reaction to whatever cyber attack takes place and what kind of a price you want to inflict on the adversary. And the question is very complex because of the issues that were already discussed here, the attribution issue, and the political decision that's behind it, and so on. So I think that one of the reasons, actually addressing also the earlier question about why 140 countries have developing cyber capabilities, is because we all understand that cyber is all about defense. Creating cyber resilience and being able to defend whatever assets we think should be protected. And so for that matter, basically you would need four things. You would need to have, of course, the operational capability and the intelligence and so on, but you need the tools. So in that respect, you have to develop the adequate tools to be able to instill them in the systems and make sure that people can operate them, which means that you also have to develop the human factor. But beyond that is a clear understanding that partnerships are the most important factor that we don't really work on and realize and fully exploit. This potential, the potential of cooperation and of partnerships, basically, is actually the basic tenet for all of this issue. And I think in that respect, you're also right to mention that countries have to understand each other better, that they also have to be able to create these partnerships, and that, in my mind, is one of the base deterrents. You understand as an assailant, you're not, as an attacker, you're looking at the weaknesses, the technological weaknesses of your adversary. You're looking at a political constellation, usually it's part of something else. And so if you see that the defender has not only the tools and the capabilities, but also partnerships, which means that he has sort of a broader front, that's where things become more complicated, and he will be looking for another opportunity, whether it's cybercrime, but of course also state-sponsored cyber attacks.
Yoko, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, can I just intervene regarding the deterrent thing?
Yeah.
So I think that,
And you can tie it to critical infrastructures too. It's having the right policies in place to deal with this, but it's not just critical infrastructures. We haven't seen the big cyber war, but we have seen a lot of bad events.
Yeah, but what I would like to tell you is, I would like to share with you is, there is still some, different perspectives, what the deterrence is, and between Western countries and some other countries. And, it is, there's some countries a little different. When they're trying to get the information out of their way, they're not going to reveal their own information. Their military budget and equipment situation are suspected to be quite different from the, the number and the scale, so which is published. So maybe, we need to sort of track down what the deterrence is, and we need to maybe define the term, I think, because some countries have different notions from the Western countries, I think. Yeah, and also, I'm sorry to say, just a short comment, for the failure of UNGGE things. I mean, we've been working on this issue for years and years and years. But this summer as well, that some Latin countries provoked and it just failed. So maybe some countries have started to talk about maybe the other sort of framework like OSCE or ARF, might, take place of that. So I would like to, speak up the things.
Others? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to respond to the deterrence issues. I think there are two levels. First, if you are a country with strong capabilities and the resources, the problem for deterrence is technical problems. It's how you do attribution, how you send it in signals be received, and how you put your resources to punish the target countries. But if you are less developed countries, less capabilities in cyber space, I think the problem is politically. Since you do not have for example, like the cross-domain deterrence, so you use the commercial resources, you use the political resources to deter others, to punish others. But if you are small countries, you do not have that kind of resources. How are you going to establish your own deterrence strategy? I think this should be taken into the consideration, but I don't know whether other people have some.
Yeah, just to add to that really, and talking about deterrence, and particularly I mentioned the threat to critical national infrastructure, there's an element here where there's a concern that it's not just when a disruptive attack occurs, but the potential pre-positioning capability on, for example, energy sector. So when we detect intrusion into the networks of an energy company, is that just for commercial espionage, or is it intending to have a potential effect in the future, and therefore is a coercive ability? I think, so when we talk about deterrence, we quickly get into the response, but I think there's a really important deterrence by denial of benefit, which is not necessarily dependent on attribution or on the ability to respond, but is basically, let's improve our protection, but more than that, let's improve our resilience, so that when we do suffer cyber disruptive attacks, we are able to recover quickly, and demonstrating that will be a form of deterrence. From the UK's perspective, we've looked at this and we agree with Chris that the absence of any kind of response to to cyber attacks is creating a norm that people can get away with this. We think it's not about cyber on cyber. It's not about having an offensive cyber capability to whack back whoever you think is doing it, although that is potentially one tool, but it's a whole of government response to the issue. So drawing on all of the economic, political and other levers that you have talked about, which I agree with. But most importantly, I think, is it needs to be a collective response, and we too are keen on building alliances, partnerships with other countries, where that it's not just one country standing alone, particularly if that country does not have the capabilities, as you say, but we are forming a collective response to this kind of activity, and you obviously quickly get back into the norms debate and the norms area with that.
Anyone else? Paolo?
Are we now open, correct?
Well, we're open, so if you want to comment on that.
Gotcha.
I have one more thing on deterrence, but if you want to address that, that'd be great.
No, two comments. One, an institutional and diplomatic one. You mentioned G7. I think it's worthwhile remembering that G7 this year addressed cyber at least in 3 different parts of its exercises. One more on a general level, on heads of state and government, fine. But I would like to mention here 2 sectoral exercises, not the correct word, but 2 sectoral approaches at G7 level on energy sector and on financial sector, both of them in terms of both best practices, as well as practical steps to be taken for the financial sector, it's quite clear, in order to strengthen resilience of the global financial system. And I think this is something quite important to keep in mind, because on this, the pace of both attacks, but at the same time awareness in needing to take concrete steps to, let's say, augment resilience has been taken and is underway. Both, let's say, a second and more general reflection is, again, let me be a bit bottom liner again and a bit substantive. What is that we are saying here? My sense is that we need a bit of a change in perspective. This is, at least from my perspective, my experience, and my impression is also from the experience of colleagues at government level, is that when you say militarization of the net, maybe we are not getting the right point. It's the opposite, if I may. Were it militarized, it would be easy, because we would know what norms to apply. And it is exactly the opposite. It is not militarized, and the theater of operations is civil. That's the point. It is not military. You may have cyber, let's say, together with a military operation, fair enough, and that goes, let's say, by its way. On the other hand, what we are seeing is increasing number of even global events on the civil realm, and this is something that needs to somehow increase the reflection on a common need to react, have norms that help groups of countries to have a common view. And what is the, let's say, when I say theater operation, I mean the real area is the one, all those attacks which are under the threshold of, let's say, of an armed attack by international norms. This is, to me, the majority of the issue today, if I may put it this way, bluntly. Last, final, quick thing. From a government perspective, from this perspective, a perspective of who has to give an assessment on a situation, what is currently lacking, I find that every time, it's lacking a reliable, established channel of communication at this level between like-minded countries when it comes to understand what's going on. We do have many channels of communications. These are all tend to be sectoral, military, intel, diplo, others. in case of an international event, when you are under a serious time pressure to give an answer about what's going on, how much is your country affected, what is it, a channel of communication that has to have it, let's say, established and confidentiality norms and so on, is something that I think we should reflect at international level. It's a little brick, something specific, but we'll see. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I guess my personal opinion is that we don't do deterrence well enough in this area. I mean, you only deter bad actors if you have a credible and timely response. And I don't think our responses have been all that timely. And I don't think we have enough of other credible tools out there. We've talked about diplomatic. We've talked about kinetic and cyber. We've talked about economic, but we really don't have a good enough toolkit, and that's something we need to think about. And I also agree with some of the panelists saying that we need to band together and maybe smaller groups of countries to think about how we take action and bring more legitimacy to response to these actions. And there's a lot of inherent issues with that too. We do have good entanglement, which has prevented the real bad cyber incidents. That doesn't really deter the rogue nation actors, but it does deter others. We have resilience, and I agree with that, but I think we still have a problem here, and that contributes to instability. I want to turn now to the audience, because I think one of the most rich parts of these discussions are really the questions from you guys. You can direct them to an individual or just direct them largely to the group, and we will be happy to take your questions and maybe do a roundup of the panel at the end. So whoever, there are microphones set up, so anyone who wants to go to a microphone, please.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm Major Chakravarti. My questions are related to Yoko and Iddo. When you look at the militarization of cyberspace, it's a real offensive weapon. All of you, including the NATO rep, spoke of cyber defense. But I think in his words, Chris Painter really said, when you look at it, credible deterrence comes only, as the Chinese speaker said, from an offensive capability. And in that way, I feel the Stuxnet, or whether you take many other issues. I want to ask, firstly, Yoko, North Korea has been firing all these missiles in their nuclear program. Why couldn't Japan undertake cyber operations to degrade the whole issue? It's so simple. I mean to say, you got a technology. Believe me, I'm a military man and who deals with it. I'm not talking. I exactly would like to say this to you. It's nice to make sweet talk and nice conversation. This is not a Hollywood movie. It's cyber military operations. And military people can't be like yesterday we had at Las Vegas. You have people at the door of the 32nd floor, but we say we want a SWAT team to come. That means you lack offensive capability as a policeman to take on a guy who has injured 550 people. Why is Japan silent on it? You have tremendous technology. This is my simple question, whichever. And to Yoko, I want to tell you, I want to hear from you. You have got tremendous cyber capability, and your operations are offensive. It's known in the open domain. How is it that you are saying that it is defensive capability which will help you, and how you have failed to degrade Iran today in the ballistic missile capability? I would like straight answers from you.
I'll do my best.
All right, I turn to my panelists to answer that simple question.
I can start with you. Yeah? Sure. So thank you for your question, for a very direct question, which points to a very important topic. It's not just Iran, there are other countries that abuse cyber. And I think the question is very important in the sense that we have to understand what cybersecurity is about. And to us, cybersecurity is about defense. It's about defending our assets, it's defending our economy, it's defending our population, and it's not just Israel. We understand that that's a global effort. So therefore, we see cybersecurity as a defensive operation. I'm not going to talk about any offensive. I'm not part of the military, and I'm not in a position to discuss that. But when it comes to Iran, we know that Iran plays what kind of role Iran plays in our region in supporting terrorism, terrorist organizations, in destabilizing the region and so on. And so cyber is probably also part of what their tool box also comprises. And so in that sense, we are aware of that. But I think the most important thing to understand for all of us is that when we're talking about security, it's a collective effort and it's a collective defensive effort. Now, there is a question, what is defense? And what's the difference between defense and offense? And what do you mean when you are talking about defense? Is it, what is active defense? What all of us in some way understand very well, but I'm not sure we can agree on, internationally agree what that is exactly. But that is what we are doing, active defense. I'll leave it at that.
So thank you so very much for your honest and frank questions. So in this audience, how many of you really think that Japan is so silent and quiet for this cybersecurity approach? Please raise your hand. Thank you. Maybe a few. Thanks. All right. For your questions, okay, I have to answer you. Right. We do have the Constitution. I have to tell you the first thing. Now, the Japanese, Prime Minister Abe, our current administration, are talking about very seriously, when and how we should revise the Constitution so that we might be able to contribute to be able to have a capacity to utilize the offense capabilities. And I personally, I believe that if we need to do, for the cyber defense, we need to have the capability of the cyber offense, of course. Why not? But in Japan, we really do have a restrict, constitution, and we cannot implement, the cyber offense right now. And my personal observation is that escalation is not really good. Look at this world right now. Escalation and escalation and escalation. Where can we work? Where can we find peace or stability, right? Of course, sometimes only dialogues would not work for the the rogue nations, of course. But it is very easy to attack. It is very easy, probably, to get together and cause war. But it's going to be really chaos. Of course, I really don't think that we need strategic patience, maybe, but we need to really think about that. And sometimes, I have some chances to meet up with my colleague from South Korea government officials. Of course, the conclusion is probably so easy to countermeasure against North
So
Korea.
we just need to, I know we're wrapping. So apparently 7 minutes magically disappeared from our clock. So I don't know what happened to it, but so we'll have to move it a little quicker. I'll just say, speaking of my personal capacity, which is what I do these days, I think that it is important for countries to be transparent about their cyber capabilities, because they're going to have them. And a country that tells you they have no cyber capabilities is just lying. And second, there has to be doctrine around those capabilities which govern how they're used. But third, I think there's this myth that there's a giant cyber button somewhere that if you hit it, you can deal with anything. And that's frankly not true. I don't think that the cyber capabilities are often overblown. Even if they can have some action, to actually have that action take place over a period of time is much harder. So I think you have to cabin this discussion a little bit too. Other questions? We'll take two more and then we'll just quickly wrap up. Yeah.
Well, we had a lot of discussion about deterrence, and normally deterrence, as we understand it, depends upon two things. One is a denial to the adversary, and the second is an assured retaliatory capacity. But there is one aspect of deterrence underlying this which we didn't talk about, and that is an international legal regime. In this particular case, now when we talk, say, nuclear, we can say that X country is a rogue state or whatever, or their nuclear program should be stopped.
Right. So
But in the cyber thing, every country, ranging from US to Russia to China to North Korea to Iran to maybe Japan, is seeking to take
interest of time, I'm going to
advantage.
boil your question down to, do you need an international legal regime?
So
to deal
therefore,
with this?
unless you develop
Okay.
a legal regime, a norm,
I understand what you're saying.
You
We'll raise
won't-
it for the panel. And just the next question, just very quickly, one sentence, one quick question, then we have to go. You're done? Okay, quickly. And then I'm going to go to the panel.
Hello, we talked about, but we didn't talk at all about the state-sponsored terrorism, cyber terrorism,
Okay?
and
So
what the law, what we are going to do about it.
Okay, I'll raise that. Okay, with those two questions, since we're running out of time, I'm just going to go down the panel. Anyone that wants to address those or anything else in the 3 minutes we have left, please do. I guess while you're thinking about it, on the international legal regime, this is a topic that's come up before, and I would challenge you on a practical level to be able to put people talked about a treaty for cyberspace. I don't know what that means. I don't know, how you figure out what a cyber weapon is. I don't think this really applies well in cyberspace, and frankly, I think it would take about 10 years to reach some agreement on this. So even if a regime in the long term makes sense, I think there's a lot of work to be done in building norms and understanding before you even get to that point. And if people put all their eggs in the legal regime basket, that's going to be a much more long-term effort. But please, others, yeah. Nate, yep.
Just
NATO.
to echo that point, Chris, yes, a normative framework, a legal regime is very important. But as a lot of countries have put forth, international law does apply in cyberspace. Now, as Chris said, the challenge is figuring out how. And so I think to empower initiatives already underway to explore those questions, Article 51 of the UN Charter, law of armed conflict, those, for example, talent manual discussions for operations within conflict, but then also activities during peacetime, important to build on the work that's already going on, and would echo that international law applies, figuring out how, and a treaty at this point would be infeasible.
Anyone else on either that or the terrorism issue?
So
Or anything else you
Just
wanna
quickly,
address?
I mean, I'm not sure I entirely understand what state-sponsored terrorism you might mean, but if it's state-sponsored, then the conversation we've been having about attribution, norms of behaviour, and all of that comes into place because the state is responsible for what it is sponsoring. If it's terrorism, though, and the thing that concerns me most in this, and where you get back to the importance of defence and deterrence by denial, is the fact terrorists are not going to be constrained by any of the legal, political, moral constraints that we abide by, and most states do. So the potential for terrorists to get hold of this kind of capabilities and not be constrained at all in the way that they use them is something I think that we all need to collectively focus our efforts on and take steps now to start defending ourselves against.
Okay. I think there are a lot of the effort have been done to, to establish some kind of the order in cyberspace, and from governmental level, from the private sector, and also from academic. But like Chris said, we need a lot of times. But for me, I think important the step to let the United Nations to play its functions. Like after World War II, you have the UN become the core of international security actor. But in cyberspace, we do not have that architecture. At least I think it's valuable to discuss about that.
Okay. Any last comments by anyone else? We have no time, but if you want to just make a quick comment. All right. Look, I think I want to thank all of our panelists. I hope you thank them too for this discussion. Sorry we didn't get to take more questions, but certainly I think all of them will be willing to talk to you afterwards. This is a complex and really evolving area. Every year, I think new developments happen here. And I think it's going to be something that's going to be percolating in almost every international forum around the world, regional fora, other areas. I know the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace is looking at this as one venue, but many venues discuss this, and that's good because I think we have a lot more learning to do. So again, if you could thank all of our panelists, we appreciate everything you've done, and we look forward to the discussion over the next 2 days.